You must marry my daughter.
No, sir, I cannot. I cannot do that.
The most powerful man I had ever known, the man who built Vance Holdings from a single lumberyard into a $6 billion empire, was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his arms, telling his land steward to marry me. And the land steward, a quiet man with a title older than this country's constitution, and a 5-year-old boy who called the main house the big house, looked my dying father in the eye and said no. That was the moment the room stopped breathing. Not just me, everyone. The lawyers, my Uncle Reginald who had been leaning against the window frame like a man waiting for a horse race to end. The nurses who had no business being in that conversation but had frozen in the doorway anyway. Everyone went silent. Because in 31 years of watching people orbit Julian Vance's money, grasping at it, bowing for it, lying for it, building entire personalities around being close to it, not one single person had ever turned it down. Until Edmund Ashworth did, and I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I was not the kind of daughter people proposed to. I was the Vance heiress, yes, 5'6", 240 pounds. A face my mother's friends at the country club called such a shame because the cheekbones were good, the eyes were striking, and the skin was clear. But the body they whispered behind their champagne flutes ruined the whole picture. I had been the fat daughter of a billionaire for 31 years. I knew exactly what I was worth on paper and exactly what I was worth at a dinner party. Those two numbers had never been the same, so when my father from his deathbed offered a man everything he had in exchange for marrying me, and that man said no, I did not feel rescued. I felt something far more dangerous. I felt curious. But what none of us knew that afternoon, what I wouldn't learn for another 6 weeks, was that my father's dying words were never a proposal. They were a confession, and the man who refused a billion-dollar bride was carrying a wound that my family put there. The room smelled like antiseptic and old money. My father's private suite at St. Catherine's was the size of a small apartment, a concession, the hospital board said to one of their most generous donors. Julian Vance had funded the entire cardiac wing. Now he was dying in it. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The diagnosis had come 11 weeks earlier, and in those 11 weeks, my father had not slowed down. He had reorganized his will, restructured his charitable trusts, fired 2 board members he had always hated, and eaten his favorite lamb chops every single Thursday as if the tumor were someone else's problem. But that morning, his hands shook when he lifted the water glass. I noticed, he noticed me noticing, and for the first time in my life, my father looked away from me first. "Bring him in," he said. I didn't know who he meant. The door opened, and Edmund Ashworth walked in. I knew Edmund the way you know the gardener or the postman, by function, not by person. He was the land steward for the Vance estate's northern acreage. He managed the tenant farms, the woodland conservation, the boundary disputes. He wore work boots and a canvas jacket. He had a quiet, steady voice that I had heard exactly twice, once at a harvest supper when he'd thanked my father for the food, and once when his little boy Theo had wandered into the main house and Edmund had come to collect him, apologizing like a man who had accidentally trespassed on holy ground. What I did not know, what almost no one knew, was that Edmund Ashworth was, by blood, the Duke of Camden. The title went back 400 years. Camden Hall had been one of the great estates, but Edmund's father had gambled it away, and his grandfather before that had taxed it into ruin, and by the time the title passed to Edmund at 23, there was nothing left but the name and a crumbling coat of arms above a door that now belonged to a hotel chain, a duke with no land, no money, and no pretense. He stood at the foot of my father's bed in his work boots, and my father said, "Edmund, I need you to marry my daughter." The lawyers shifted. I felt my spine go rigid. Edmund looked at my father. Then he looked at me. Not the way men usually looked at me. That quick flick of assessment. The gaze that catalogued my body and filed it under unfortunate. He looked at my face, held it, then looked back at my father. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I can't do that." My father's jaw tightened. "I'm offering you everything. The estate management contract for life. A seat on the Vance Holdings advisory board. Medical care for Theo, fully covered. A trust fund for his education." Edmund didn't blink. "I understand what you're offering." "Then, what possible reason?" "Because I have a 5-year-old son." Edmund's voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. It was the voice of a man who had practiced being steady when everything around him shook. And I will not teach him that a title is something you trade, or that a marriage is something you sell. Not for money, not for security, not even for survival. He paused. Your daughter deserves someone who chooses her, not someone who was purchased. The silence after that was absolute, and in that silence something inside me, something I had kept very still for a very long time, shifted. I learned who Edmund Ashworth really was in pieces, not because he hid, because nobody had ever bothered to look after my father's offer and Edmund's refusal. The room had cleared. Reginald, my father's younger brother, the man who ran Vance Holdings' construction division and smiled like a man counting someone else's money, had patted my shoulder on the way out and said, "Don't worry, Jenny, your father's medicated. He doesn't know what he's saying. He knew exactly what he was saying, but I would understand that later." That evening, I drove to the estate's north gate and parked where the paved road turned to gravel. The steward's cottage sat at the edge of the oak woodland, small, whitewashed, with a blue door and a vegetable garden that was neater than any room in the main house. Through the kitchen window, I could see Edmund sitting at a scarred wooden table, helping a small boy with what looked like a reading book. Theo Ashworth, 5 years old. Sandy hair like his father's glasses that were slightly too big for his face. He was the kind of child who held your hand with both of his, who whispered when he was excited, who drew pictures of birds with colored pencils and left them tucked under stones for people to find. His mother, Edmund's wife, Eliza, had died when Theo was 2. I didn't know the details then. I knew only what the estate staff whispered, that she had been ill, that there had been some kind of insurance problem, that Edmund had sold the last of his family's possessions, a set of silver candlesticks, an 18th century writing desk, to pay for treatment that came 3 months too late. A duke who sold his heritage to save his wife and lost her anyway. I sat in my car in the dark, watching Edmund read with his son, and I thought about what he had said in that hospital room. Your daughter deserves someone who chooses her. Nobody had ever said that about me. Not once. Not in 31 years. Every man who had ever come close had come for the Vance name, the Vance money, the Vance connections. I was the obstacle between them and the fortune, the fat girl they had to flatter in order to reach her father. Edmund hadn't flattered me. He hadn't pitied me. He had, in front of a room full of lawyers, treated me like a person who deserved more than a transaction, and then he had walked away from the only safety net his son had. I didn't drive up to the cottage that night. I went home, but I didn't sleep, because here's what nobody in that hospital room understood. Not the lawyers, not Reginald, maybe not even my father. Edmund Ashworth was not a simple land steward who happened to have an old title. He had a first-class degree in land management from Durham. He had rebuilt the northern acreage's soil quality in 4 years, when 3 agricultural consultants had failed in a decade. He had introduced a rotation system that increased the tenant farmers' yields by 30%, while reducing chemical use by half. He had done it all quietly, without asking for credit, living in a cottage that leaked when it rained, because the salary my father paid him was barely enough to cover Theo's school fees and the rent on a life that was one emergency away from collapse. The world saw a worker in muddy boots. I was beginning to see something else entirely. 3 days after Edmund's refusal, my father told me the truth. He was weaker. The morphine was higher. But his mind, that Vance mind that had outmaneuvered bankers and regulators and 2 government investigations, was still sharp enough to cut glass. Sit down, Genevieve. I sat. You think I asked Edmund to marry you because I'm dying and desperate and sentimental? Aren't you? A ghost of a smile. Partly, but mostly I asked him because of paragraph 14, précis of the Vance Family Trust. He told me to read it. So I did. It took me 20 minutes and 2 readings to understand what my grandfather, Julian's father, the original architect of the Vance fortune, had built into the trust's governance structure. Paragraph 14. C. In the event of the primary beneficiary's assumption of control, operational authority over Vance Holdings shall vest only upon the beneficiary's legal marriage or the appointment of a co-trustee approved by a 2/3 board majority. In plain language, I could inherit everything, but I couldn't run it, couldn't vote my own shares, couldn't appoint directors, couldn't block a hostile restructuring unless I had a legally recognized spouse, or unless 2/3 of the board, which my uncle Reginald had been stacking with his allies for 15 years, voted to let me. Reginald knows, my father said. He's known for years. He's been waiting for this. I felt cold. not surprised. I had never trusted my uncle, but cold, the way you feel when you realize the ground you've been standing on has always been hollow. So you offered Edmund, the only honest man on this estate, the only man I've ever met who would refuse a bribe on principle, and the only man who would never, under any circumstances, try to take what's yours. I stared at my father. You weren't buying me a husband, I said slowly. You were buying me a shield. I was trying, my father said, to give you the one thing I can't put in a will. A partner who cannot be corrupted. The monitor beeped. His hand found mine. His fingers were cold. Edmund is a good man, Genevieve, better than me, better than anyone in this family, and I owe him more than you know. What do you mean? My father closed his eyes. That, he whispered, is the part I'm not brave enough to tell you yet. But here's the thing about dying men and their timing. He told me the next morning. And what he said changed everything I thought I knew about my family, about Edmund, and about the real reason a man in muddy boots had every right to hate the name Vance. My father was crying. I had never seen Julian Vance cry. Not when my mother left. Not when his own father died. Not when the diagnosis came. He had a way of absorbing grief into his posture, squaring his shoulders, tightening his jaw, converting pain into momentum. But that morning, with the morphine making his edges soft and the sunlight coming in flat through the hospital blinds, he cried, 7 years ago. He said, Reginald's construction division bid on the Harlow Bridge Overpass project. I knew the project. It had been a flagship, Vance Holdings' biggest public infrastructure contract. It had won awards. During the build, Edmund was managing the adjacent estate land. He noticed soil subsidence near the eastern pylons. He flagged it, sent reports, 3 of them, detailed, professional, irrefutable. My father's voice caught. Reginald buried them. The project was behind schedule and over budget. A subsidence investigation would have cost 6 months and £12 million. So Reginald told the site manager to file Edmund's reports as external consultation, no action required, and I signed off on it. You signed off on burying safety reports. I signed a summary page that said all external concerns had been reviewed and addressed. I didn't read the attached files. I trusted Reginald, and that trust. He stopped, breathed. That trust killed Edmund's wife. The room tilted. 3 months after the reports were buried, Edmund raised the issue again, directly at a board meeting that Reginald chaired. Reginald had him removed from the meeting. Then he had Edmund's stewardship contract flagged for review, which meant his employer-sponsored medical insurance was suspended, pending the outcome of the review. I could see where this was going. I didn't want to see it. Eliza Ashworth had been diagnosed with an aggressive lymphoma 6 weeks before the review. She was responding to treatment. The oncologist said she had a real chance, but the next round of chemotherapy required a specific immunotherapy drug that cost £4,000 per infusion. And without insurance? Stop. Edmund sold everything he had. The desk, the silver, his mother's ring. It wasn't enough by the time the review was resolved and his insurance reinstated. 11 weeks later, the window for that drug combination had closed. My father looked at the ceiling. She died 14 months later. She was 31 years old, and their son was 2. I sat very still. Edmund never sued, my father said, never went public, never accused me or Reginald of anything. He came back to work 3 weeks after the funeral because he had a child to feed and nowhere else to go. Why are you telling me this now? Because when I asked him to marry you and he said no, he had every reason in the world to say yes. Money, security, revenge. He could have taken everything I offered, married you, and bled this family dry, and he would have been justified. My father turned his face to mine. His eyes were ruined. He said no because he is the man I should have been. And you, Genevieve, you deserve to know that the fortune you're about to inherit was built on the back of a man who lost his wife because your father was too lazy to read an attachment. I walked out of that room and sat in the hospital car park for an hour. I did not cry. I was beyond crying. I was in that place where grief and fury and shame merge into something quiet and heavy that sits in your chest like a stone. My father had asked Edmund to marry me, not just to protect me from Reginald, but to atone, to give back in the only currency he had left, something he could never truly repay. And Edmund, the man who had lost his wife because of us, had still said no, not out of spite, not out of hatred, because he would not let his son believe that integrity had a price. I started the car, I drove to the estate, I sat outside the cottage with the blue door until the lights went off, and I made a decision that would change both of our lives. My father died on a Tuesday. The funeral was enormous. 600 people, a cathedral. The kind of service where half the mourners are genuinely grieving and the other half are calculating what they stand to inherit. Reginald wore a black suit that cost more than Edmund's annual salary. He gave a eulogy about brotherhood and legacy. He did not mention the Harlow Bridge. He did not mention Eliza Ashworth. He did not mention me at all. 48 hours after the funeral, I received a call from the estate manager. Miss Vance, I've been instructed by Mr. Reginald Vance, in his capacity as interim board chair, to inform you that the steward's cottage on the northern acreage has been designated for redevelopment. The current tenant has been given 72 hours to vacate. 72 hours. Edmund, a man who had buried his wife because of Vance negligence, who had raised his son alone in that cottage, who had never once raised his voice or filed a claim, was being thrown out of his home 3 days after the man who owed him everything was put in the ground. But Reginald wasn't finished. The children's clinic that operated out of the estate's old schoolhouse, free pediatric care for estate workers' families, something my father had funded personally, received notice that its funding was under review. 3 nurses and a part-time pediatrician were told to expect layoffs. The review would take 6 to 12 months. Theo Ashworth's next scheduled appointment for the mild asthma he'd had since he was a baby was cancelled. Reginald was moving fast. He knew the trust clause, he knew I was unmarried, and he knew that every day I didn't have a spouse or a supermajority on the board, he could strip assets, redirect funding, and restructure the company until there was nothing left for me to inherit but a name. I called my father's lawyer that night. How long do I have before Reginald locks me out completely? 90 days. The probate process gives you a 90-day window to satisfy paragraph 14C. After that, the board can vote to appoint an interim CEO. Reginald has the votes. 90 days, I hung up. I sat in my father's study, a room that still smelled like his cologne and old paper, and I thought about Edmund's face when he said no. Then I stood up, got in my car, and drove to the cottage with the blue door. It was 9 in the evening. Theo was asleep. Edmund opened the door in a flannel shirt with his sleeves rolled up, and for a moment the surprise on his face made him look younger than his 34 years. "Miss Vance, Genevieve," I said. "May I come in?" He stepped aside. The cottage was warm and spare. Books everywhere, not decorative books, real ones, with cracked spines and sticky notes and dog-eared pages. A child's drawing was pinned to the fridge, a house, a tree, a man and a boy holding hands. No woman. I sat at the kitchen table. He sat across from me. He didn't offer tea, he waited. "Reginald is evicting you in 72 hours, I said. "I know." He shut down the children's clinic. Theo's appointment has been cancelled. Something moved behind Edmund's eyes. Not panic, he was too practiced for panic, but fear, the specific controlled fear of a parent who has already lost one person and cannot lose another. "I know that too. I have a proposition," I said, "and I want you to hear all of it before you say no." He folded his hands on the table. Steady hands. Work-scarred hands. The hands of a man who fixed things. "My father's trust has a clause. I can't control Vance Holdings unless I'm married. Reginald knows this. He's been planning for years. In 90 days, he will take the board, restructure the company, and strip every charitable program my father built, including the clinic, the conservation land, and the tenant protections you've spent 4 years developing." "I'm aware of the clause," Edmund said quietly. "Your father explained it to me. The day he asked me to." "Marry me." "Yes." Silence. "I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Edmund. I'm asking you for 90 days. A marriage of convenience, legal, public, temporary. I've had my lawyers draft a prenuptial agreement that protects you completely. You keep your title, your autonomy, your land management role. Nothing I own becomes yours. Nothing you owe becomes mine. At the end of 90 days, once I've secured board control and locked Reginald out, we file for an annulment. Clean, simple, done." He was quiet for a long time. Why me? Because my father was right about one thing. You are the only person on this estate who can't be bought, and Reginald knows it. If I marry someone he can corrupt, he'll find a way around the clause. But if I marry the one man who already told a dying billionaire no, I stopped, took a breath. And because I know what my family did to you, What we cost you, I cannot undo that, but I can make sure that the man who buried your safety reports never controls the company that paid for the bridge that should have been stopped." Edmund looked at the fridge, at the drawing, the house, the tree, the man and the boy. "Theo's appointment," he said. Not a question reinstated. The clinic fully funded, written into the prenup as a binding condition. He pressed his thumbs against his temples. He breathed. And then he said something I wasn't expecting. "Miss Vance, Genevieve, if I do this, and the tabloids find out, and they'll call me a gold-digging title chaser who married a rich woman for her money. They'll call you the fat heiress who had to buy a husband. I've been the fat daughter, the fat niece, the fat Vance girl for 31 years. I think I can survive 90 more days." He looked at me. Really looked at me. And for the second time, I saw something in his expression that I couldn't name. Something that was not pity, not assessment, not calculation. "All right," he said, "for Theo, for the clinic, for 90 days? We shook hands across the kitchen table. I noticed his hand was warm. I noticed mine was shaking. I noticed I didn't want to let go. We were married on a Thursday morning at the county registrar's office. No guests, no flowers. A civil ceremony that lasted 11 minutes. Edmund wore his only good jacket, navy, slightly too big in the shoulders. I wore a cream dress I had bought the day before because none of my mother's hand-me-downs had ever fit me, and I refused to care about that anymore. Theo was our witness. He stood between us, holding both our hands. And when the registrar said, "You may kiss the bride," Edmund and I looked at each other, and Edmund kissed my cheek. Softly, precisely the way you handle something you're afraid to break. We drove back to the estate. Edmund and Theo moved into the east wing of the main house. A practical decision, visible enough for the trust's requirements, separate enough for our sanity. We established rules, separate bedrooms, professional distance, no performance of affection in private. In public we would be polite, coordinated, united. It lasted exactly 4 days before the tabloids arrived. Gold-digging poor Duke marries, fat heiress, Vance fortune at stake, Duke of nothing, bankrupt aristocrat weds billionaire's plus-size daughter in shotgun estate deal, the bride nobody wanted, inside the Vance family's desperate arranged marriage. I read them all. I read every word, every photograph, the paparazzi shots of me walking to my car in a coat that made me look larger than I was, the side-by-side comparisons of Edmund's handsome aristocratic features against my unfortunate proportions. I read the comment sections, which were worse. I read them because I had learned years ago that the only way to survive cruelty was to let it pass through you without staying. Edmund found me reading them at the breakfast table. "Stop," he said. "I'm fine, you're not. And I won't have those words in the same room as my son." He took the tablet from my hands, gently, firmly. "The way you take a sharp object from someone who doesn't realize they're cutting themselves." "They're talking about both of us," I said. "Let them. I've been called worse by better." I almost smiled, but here's the thing about paper marriages. They have a way of becoming real when a 5-year-old is involved. Theo didn't read tabloids. Theo didn't know about trust clauses or probate windows or corporate governance. Theo knew that there was a woman in the house who let him sit on the kitchen counter while she made breakfast, who read him 3 stories at bedtime instead of 2, who never, not once, told him to be quieter, take up less space, or go play somewhere else. On the 6th morning, I came downstairs and found a drawing on my chair. 3 stick figures, one tall and thin, one short with big glasses, one round and smiling with yellow hair. "That's you," Theo said, pointing at the round one. "I gave you a crown because your house is like a castle." I held that piece of paper and something inside me broke open. Not painfully, but the way ice breaks in spring. Something that had been frozen for so long I had forgotten it was there. Edmund was standing in the doorway. He had seen the drawing. He had seen my face. He didn't say anything, but that evening, for the first time, he sat in the living room after Theo was asleep. Not in the east wing, not behind a closed door. He sat in the armchair by the fire and read, and I sat on the sofa and worked, and neither of us spoke, and it was the most peaceful hour I had spent in years. Week 3, week 4. The paper marriage developed a pulse. Edmund started leaving a cup of tea outside my study door at 7 in the morning. Earl Grey, no sugar, which he'd somehow noticed without asking. I started cutting the crusts off Theo's sandwiches the way Edmund did, diagonal, not straight, because Theo had once explained that triangles taste better. It's science. We disagreed about music, agreed about books, argued about garden design with a heat that surprised us both, and every evening after Theo was asleep, we sat in that living room, and the silence between us got warmer and warmer and warmer. I was falling, I knew I was falling, and I told myself it didn't matter, because in 90 days this would be over, and Edmund would go back to his cottage, and I would go back to being the Vance heiress in a house too big for one person. But then, on the 42nd day of our arrangement, everything detonated. Edmund came into my study at 10 at night, and I knew from his face that something was wrong. He put a folder on my desk. Inside were documents. Internal Vance Holdings correspondence from 7 years ago, marked confidential, board eyes only. "Where did you find these?" I asked. "Your father's personal safe. The combination was in his will addressed to me. He wanted me to have them after he died." I read the documents, and the floor fell out. My father's confession in the hospital had been incomplete. He hadn't just failed to read an attachment. He had been in the room when Reginald proposed burying Edmund's safety reports. He had debated it. He had weighed the cost, £12 million and 6 months of delay against the risk, and he had made a decision. Julian Vance had looked at the numbers and decided that a man's safety concerns were less important than a project's bottom line. He hadn't been negligent. He had been deliberate. And because of that deliberate choice, Eliza Ashworth's insurance had been suspended, her treatment had been delayed, and she had died. I couldn't look at Edmund. "I didn't know," I whispered. "Edmund, I swear I didn't. I know you didn't. My father told me he signed a summary without reading. He said he trusted Reginald. He lied. He lied to make you grieve him less. But I needed you to know the truth, because you are about to take control of a company, and you need to know exactly what that company is capable of." The silence was terrible. I opened my desk drawer. Inside was a document I had prepared on the first day of our arrangement. A failsafe, a precaution, an exit I had hoped I would never need. I slid it across the desk, signed annulment papers. "What is this?" Edmund said. "Your way out?" "The papers are legally valid. If you file them, the marriage is dissolved and you owe me nothing. Reginald wins the board, I lose the company, and none of that is your problem. Genevieve, you don't deserve to carry my family's sins, Edmund. My father used you. He used your decency, your poverty, your grief. He used all of it to buy himself forgiveness, and My voice broke. I hadn't expected it to break. I'm doing the same thing. I told myself this was about the clinic, about the employees, about Reginald. But the truth is, I needed you, and needing someone who has every reason to hate your name is just a more polite form of what my father did. I pushed the papers closer. "Take Theo. Go be free of us." Edmund picked up the papers. He looked at them for a long time. Then he put them back on the desk unsigned and said 5 words that changed everything. "I am not going anywhere." Day 87, the probate hearing. The courtroom was polished oak and fluorescent lighting, that particular blend of ceremony and bureaucracy that makes justice feel both grand and mundane. Reginald sat on the other side of the aisle with 3 lawyers, a restructuring consultant, and the quiet confidence of a man who had been planning this takeover for 15 years. He had reason to be confident. He had the board votes, he had the precedent, and he had, just 2 days earlier, sent Edmund a private message offering him £2 million to sign the annulment papers and walk away. Edmund had not responded. "The petitioner calls Edmund Ashworth," my lawyer said. Edmund stood. He was wearing the navy jacket. It still didn't fit properly. He carried a leather satchel that had belonged to his grandfather, the last duke who had owned anything worth keeping. He walked to the witness stand, and Reginald's lawyers smiled, because they expected what everyone always expected from Edmund Ashworth, a quiet man in muddy boots who would fold under pressure. They were wrong. "Mr. Ashworth," my lawyer began, "you were employed as land steward for the Vance Estate's northern acreage from 2019 to present. In that capacity, did you submit reports regarding soil subsidence near the Harlow Bridge Overpass project?" "I did. 3 reports over 7 months. Each documented measurable lateral movement in the eastern pylon foundation zone." "And what action was taken on those reports?" "None. They were classified as external consultation, no action required, and filed without review." Reginald shifted in his seat. His lead lawyer leaned forward. Edmund opened the satchel. Inside were the original reports, time-stamped, signed with chain of custody documentation that he had maintained for 7 years, because Edmund Ashworth was the kind of man who kept records because records were the truth, and the truth was non-negotiable. But that wasn't all. Mr. Ashworth, do you have additional evidence to present? I do. He placed a USB drive on the witness stand. This is a recording made by Julian Vance 3 days before his death. He requested that it be played at this hearing. The courtroom went very still. My father's voice filled the room, thin, morphine-edged, but unmistakable. My name is Julian Arthur Vance. I am of sound mind. I am making this statement because I will not be alive to make it in person, and because the man I wronged deserves to have the truth entered into public record. The recording lasted 12 minutes. My father named every document, every decision, every person in the room when the reports were buried. He named Reginald. He named himself. He described the insurance suspension, the delayed treatment, and Eliza Ashworth's death. And then he said, "My brother Reginald Vance is not fit to lead this company. He has spent 15 years stacking the board, suppressing safety findings, and preparing to strip the company's charitable obligations. I was too weak to stop him while I was alive. I'm asking the court to stop him now." Reginald stood up. His lawyers grabbed his arm. "This is inadmissible. It is a deathbed declaration," the judge said calmly, "admitted under the established exception corroborated by contemporaneous documentary evidence. Sit down, Mr. Vance." Reginald sat. The judgment came 40 minutes later. Reginald's board appointments were voided due to conflict of interest. The trust clause was satisfied. I was granted full operational authority over Vance Holdings. The clinic was saved, the tenant protections were preserved, the conservation land was secured, and then Edmund did something nobody expected. He placed the unsigned annulment papers on the courtroom table. "These are legally valid dissolution documents," he said. "Genevieve Vance, my wife, prepared them 6 weeks ago and offered them to me freely. She told me to walk away. She was willing to lose everything to let me go." He looked at me across the courtroom. "I want the record to show that I am not here because of a contract. I am here because the woman who gave me the power to leave is the reason I want to stay." I pressed my hand to my mouth. I did not cry. I did cry. 3 weeks after the hearing, Edmund moved his books from the East Wing into the main library. I didn't ask him to. He didn't announce it. I came downstairs one morning and found his agricultural journals shelved next to my father's business biographies, and his battered copy of Middlemarch wedged between 2 Vance Holdings annual reports like an interloper that belonged there all along. Theo noticed first. "Your books got married too," he told Edmund over breakfast. Edmund looked at me across the table. I looked at him. "I suppose they did," he said. "We did not rush. We had spent 90 days learning each other's shapes, the way Edmund went quiet when he was thinking and still when he was worried. The way I filled silences with facts and hid tenderness behind precision. We knew each other's damage, we had seen the worst documentation of each other's families, and we were still here. On a Sunday afternoon in late spring, Edmund took my hand. We were walking in the oak woodland, Theo running ahead, collecting acorns for a project he had described in elaborate detail, but which seemed to involve glue and optimism. "Genevieve? I would like to start again." I looked at him. Not the contract, not the arrangement, not the clause or the clinic or the trust or any of it. His thumb moved across my knuckles. "I would like to take you to dinner, a real dinner. And I would like to tell you over that dinner that I am in love with you, not because your father asked me to be, not because a legal document required it, but because you are the most principled, stubborn, compassionate, infuriating woman I have ever met, and my son draws you with a crown, and I think he's right." The oak trees moved in the wind. Theo shouted something about a squirrel. The light came through the canopy in pieces, green and gold. "I should tell you," I said, "that I'm still going to be the fat Vance heiress. The tabloids won't stop. The comments won't stop. I take up space, Edmund. Literally and otherwise." "Good," he said. "I have spent my entire life in rooms that were too small for me. I would very much like to share a big one." I laughed, and then I kissed him. Not on the cheek, not carefully, not the way you handle something fragile. I kissed him like a woman who had stopped apologizing for the space she occupied. Camden Hall was never restored. We didn't need it. The cottage with the blue door was expanded. A new room for Theo, a study for Edmund, a window seat where I could work and watch the oak trees at the same time. Reginald contested the probate ruling. He lost. He contested the board restructuring. He lost again. He sold his shares and moved to Monaco and never acknowledged that his brother's empire had been saved by the fat niece he had ignored for 31 years and the broke duke he had tried to throw out of a cottage. The children's clinic was renamed. Not after my father. Edmund and I agreed on that. After Eliza, the Eliza Ashworth Children's Health Center. Free pediatric care, fully funded, permanent. Theo drew a new picture and pinned it to the fridge. 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small with glasses, one round with a crown underneath in wobbly 5-year-old handwriting, 4 words, my family, for real. They called me the bride nobody wanted, the fat daughter, the desperate heiress, the woman who had to buy a husband because no one would choose her. And maybe for 90 days, that story was partly true. I did make a deal. I did sign a contract. I did marry a man for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. But here's what the tabloids never printed, what the comment sections never understood, what Reginald Vance, with all his board votes and his expensive lawyers, could never quite compute. The man I married for 90 days chose to stay forever. Not for the money, not for the title, not for the estate, or the company, or the trust. He stayed because a 5-year-old boy drew me with a crown. He stayed because I handed him the exit and he handed it back. He stayed because, and this is the part that still makes me cry if I think about it for too long, he looked at the woman the world called too much and saw someone who was exactly enough. So let me ask you something before you heard the rest of this story. When you first read the words, marry my daughter or lose everything, what did you think the Duke would do? Did you think he'd take the deal? Did you think he'd walk away? Or did you think, like I did, sitting in that hospital room, watching the only honest man I'd ever met turn down a fortune, that the real shock wasn't his answer? The real shock was that somebody somewhere finally said, she deserves to be chosen. Drop a crown emoji in the comments if you believed Edmund would stay before the annulment papers. Tell me, would you have signed it or walked away? And if your answer changed between the beginning and the end, that's the whole point. If you felt something during this story, if the cottage with the blue door or Theo's drawing or the moment Edmund said, I'm not going anywhere, hit you somewhere real, consider subscribing. I tell stories like this every week, stories about people the world underestimates, stories about what happens when someone finally sees you. I'll see you in the next one. Sign it or walk away.